Hello, and thanks for joining this session. My name is Paul Buffington. In the next 30 minutes, I'm excited to share with you some insights around ITSM practice innovations in one of the topics of an area that comes up a lot with enterprise customers. My role at Atlassian, I'm a principal solution engineer, and one of the things I love about my job is working with enterprise customers on a weekly basis. One, I get a chance to guide them through their journey in adopting Atlassian products, but also looking at their practices and the way they work. And so what I want to share with you today is the concept of practice innovation. Now, we'll focus on service configuration management because it's so important today and what it delivers across support teams. But this concept you actually can apply to any of your IT support practices. So let's get started and take a look at what the agenda is. First, I want to kind of step back and look at Atlassian's approach to ITSM, which will kind of set up some of the topics and the approach and the mindset and the methodology. So I want to begin there. Some of you may have heard of this before, but I just kind of do a bit of a refresh. And then I'm going to jump right into of the 30 plus practices within ITIL 4. Service configuration management has been updated. It really redefines what's going on today of what we manage in IT. And so what is that evolution? How did we get to this point that really is by cloud? Cloud has evolved what we're seeing. And so we'll look at that. And once we've looked at that evolution, I want to then take a look at the practices for an IO team and how would I scope and define the services that they manage, getting the right data, finding the right balance. Once we've gone through this and give you some insights, my whole goal today is to give you something you can take back and put into practice and try. But we also want to connect it with product. Jira Service Management, as you've learned during this sessions, during team, some fantastic updates that our product team have been working hard on around in creating new features and capability. I want to focus on some of that relates to this topic today. And then finally, where are some resources that I can continue my learning? I'll share those as we wrap up. So let's get started. Now, as I said, we're going to start with the Atlassian's approach to ITSM. And I want to kind of give you some ideas of the way that we actually view IT service management and how it fits together. Now, one thing that we have seen continuously over the last probably 4 years plus, I've been at Atlassian 6 years, is Agile is making its way into IT organizations. Sometimes that's at a very small level, and sometimes it's the entire organization. Gartner picked up in their report in 2019 and also this year in some additional research that they're finding this embrace of it. In fact, they're predicting that by 2023, if IT organizations have not made the pivot around Agile practices and the way that they can deliver capability and work and support, they're going to find parts of the organization actually going around them. So let's think about how should we approach this in Agile practices coming into an organization? Is it simply just adopting a new tool set and changing the way we work that way? And really with Atlassian, if you go back to our mission is to unleash the potential in every team. It begins with a team, but it doesn't go just right to product. One thing I love about this in working with customers and learning about it is that we ask the question, what kind of team is it? What kind of work do they do? And so as you think about the teams that you support or are as a member of, they have different levels of support. Workplace support is focused on business users, whereas someone that's in infrastructure services is sysadmins, DBAs, they have a different focus of work. But one thing they have found through the research, whether it's the DORA report or other great research out there, that high-performing teams have common attributes and ways of working. And one of the things the DORA report says, it's a combination of a couple of different things. And these are the two things I want to talk about before we shift into our practice we're focused on today. One of those is they have a strong culture. They have a way that as the members of the team collaborate and interact, they have cultural ways of interacting and working that are maybe a part of the organization overall, but they're also at the team level. And so we want to look at and consider, how do we inspire and lead teams towards better ways of working in the cultural aspect? The other area is around proven practices. Now, this is where we'll focus most of our time today, but I want to give you resources on both sides of this equation. Now, the final part of this is the products. Once we understand the way a team works It's practices that they're focused on. An example of workplace support is more about request management, and infrastructure teams are more about incidents and changes. We have different levels of work, different focuses. And that's one of the advantages that I love from all of my years in the ITSM space, both as a consultant and now in my role at Atlassian, is we can bring the products to fit the way that those teams work. And that's where Jira Service Management and the other products are a great focus and fit. Now, I'm going to focus on the other part of that above the line there, and we'll get to product a little bit later on. Now, let's talk about culture. There's no way that we can just simply overnight transform a culture. It's something that happens over time. But we can definitely lead and influence. And some of these attributes that you see on the screen here are ones that come from things that Atlassian has found in research, but also ITIL 4 has a lot to say about what are the guiding principles and values that that team or that organization will embrace. One of those being focused on co-created value, meaning I'm going to work with my stakeholders to figure out where is that value point that we're coming together to deliver a service or a capability. Or the idea of collaboration and promoting visibility. Are we open in the way that we work and share and collaborate? Or are we optimizing? And automation is a key principle and a guiding capability that we're embracing. Or the last one on my list that I love, that I'm seeing a lot of, something that comes from an improvement kata. And it's the idea of continual improvement. Instead of looking over our shoulder what we've done, we're looking out ahead. What's the North Star over the next year that we're working towards, that we're experimenting and learning from? All of these things, they fit with culture, but they also go to practices. And it's just asking us the question on how do we unlock this in our teams? As Atlassian was growing when I joined, I think 6 years ago, probably 1,400 employees. We're well over 7,000 today. And the growth has been phenomenal. But one of the things that I love about Atlassian is we've maintained our culture. We have these guiding principles and our values that everyone, you'll hear them oftentimes referenced in the meetings. And so that's a thing that we kind of come back to. One other aspect early on was, as we were growing, we said, let's look at high performing teams and what are the characteristics, and then what kind of plays could we put in place to help them learn and discover as a team, and basically take these blind spots and turn them into strengths over time. And that's where the Atlassian Team Playbook comes in. We met with so many customers that they've now come in and made it a part of making their teams and their support organization aware that this is a fantastic resource. But it's not a tops-down effort. It's something that the teams adopt themselves and make their own. So if you haven't looked at it and you're looking at ways to influence or guide the culture of the way your teams work, this is a fantastic place to start. Now let's move over to practices. Practices are the process, but also the procedures, capabilities, guiding principles that you get a little bit from the values we're talking about, but it's the way that we do work. So it's so much more than process. And one of the great things of ITIL 4 that when we looked at it over 2 years ago, we were really pleased to see is that they've shifted. The focus is now on the value that we deliver. It's very adaptable. ITIL in the past, probably because of some tool vendors, has become rigid because they're very prescriptive. ITIL 4 says, no, start where you are. You're very adaptable in that, and take the guiding principles and adapt them to the way that your teams work. But one of the things is it moves from process to practice. It thinks a little more holistically in the way the work would be done in a certain discipline. And so we want to talk about that as we go through this and focus on the one practice we've called out today in this session. Now, ITIL 4 provides a lot of fantastic guidance. One of those is back to the high performance. It says, high performance strategy is about the organization looking at these alternatives over time. They're learning organizations, they're learning teams. They're focused on what needs to be done across the organization to work together to create that value. And that value could be a service that you deliver to your internal employees, or it could be the value of what you're delivering to your customers. So it's asking those questions that ultimately come back to, how do we work to get better at this? One thing that we've published that you see on the screen here is a guide that we co-authored with Axilos. It's still the top download in Atlassian's history, and it tells us there's a hunger and an interest in better ways of working. That ITIL has a lot to say. What we've done here is we've chosen practices that align to high velocity, of which ones would we adopt if we were looking to move the needle towards a better throughput, a better result of IT support. Now, ITIL 4 has 32 published practices. Great news is they say start where you are, and these are some of the most common ones that we see. So it's, again, asking the question of, okay, for this capability in the organization, it's that I&O team that's responding and supporting the platform, which practices do they need to be successful? And so just to give you an example, I want to look at a capability for a specific flow of work and how these practices would fit into that flow of work before we focus in on one very specific one, which is service configuration management. Now, this diagram here looks at the big picture of service operations. Service operations, for the most part, will be focused on major incident response. Now, you look at that critical flow of work from when I detect that there is a significant outage and might be impacting customers to going through communicating and investigating. We have different functions and different practices that come into play. Early on, I want to know about events and alerts coming in, to then I'm now in the midst of an incident and I have different things that I'm going to do across the teams. I might be collaborating with different teams. And so this diagram is just really intended to bring together, showing you that it's not just incident management, it's multiple practices that fit together as an organization to optimize the response time to that major outage. Now, one of those that if I were able to do this, I'm getting through let's say we have a major outage and something's down. Great, I know about the outage, I know it's impacting customers, but the next thing we're going to ask ourselves is, what's impacted? What's down? Where is this run at? Who's the service owner? So there's some really critical underpinning practices that a team in IT manages that we want to make sure we have the right information to inform this critical capability, such as major incident response. So we've spent just a minute talking about Atlassian's approach to ITSM and where practices and culture fit together. Now let's focus in on practice innovations around service configuration management. And what I want to just briefly do is just a brief look back in history and look at what's the evolution that's brought us to this point where cloud has significantly transformed the way that we look at configurations that we would have in our CMDB. You know, if you think back to not too long ago, and I was actually going back to my consulting days, I'm asking myself, late 1990s, what was the most common technology that I was integrating with? And there's some of the examples on the screen here. There's many more that I could, add to the screen, and some of those are gone actually today. But the idea on this slide was IT had most of what they were dealing with behind or inside the four walls of their organization. It ran in their own data centers. In fact, it probably ran on servers inside of a server room or closet somewhere. And so this was technology that pretty much IT managed in a way they managed the full stack. Fast forward to today, that world is gone. Cloud has radically changed what we manage as an organization. A lot of that is moved into the cloud, or I'm getting services brought into the organization that are coming from other cloud providers. And what IT is managing sometimes is even moved out into the business where IT is a facilitator of it, and they might own it and they might take care of the contract, but it's really the engineering team that owns that stack of AWS or Azure or whatever those platforms are. So it's really important to understand that evolution. Now, what I find oftentimes is some IT organizations are still playing catch up to this world. I mean, we're going through this, and Gartner has some great insights on it, but we're seeing that evolving is happening inside of IT organizations. So I want to give you some ideas on how we might adapt to that new world. Now, before we do that, there is, and this goes back to ITIL. ITIL says that, something that I'm going to manage has a definition, and it could be an asset or a configuration item. And there's this differing viewpoint around these items that I want to kind of classify. Think about a car, Mercedes-Benz here, great vehicle to drive, very comfortable. What's the difference between ITAM and some might call it SCM or service configuration management? And so I want to kind of give you a difference here. ITAM would look at this car and it would say, okay, I want to know what the make and model and trim are, but I also want to know when you purchased it and your cost, because there's a financial governance component to this that I need to manage. Let's say it's a lease that we have on it, and I want to know when that begins and when it ends. I also want to know who the manufacturer is because I have, warranty information that I need to understand and the cost around that. So it's the governance of the item. I might even understand, who did we assign this out to? Who's the driver or the person is, that has now this available to them? But I'm looking at this more from this device, this item, from that governance standpoint. Could be financial, it could be simply where is it at and who's it assigned to. Now, on the other side of this, let's say that this is put into our fleet of vehicles now that are being used for some sort of service, Uber or whatever. Service configuration considerations are going to look at obviously make, model, and trim, but then it's going to look at capability. What's the range on it? Is it electric? Is it gas? What's the speed of it? How many people can it support? What are some of the onboard services? Is there satellite? Is there XM radio? So these are things that we now see this object as a service. It's delivering a capability. I want to understand how I can use this service and put it into my overall capability, such as maybe an Uber service. Also maintenance, what's coming up for maintenance and being able to keep those tracks. So if it has to go offline, I know it's not available to be sent out. And then finally, who's the owner of it? If there's a problem, if there maybe is an incident or an accident and it goes offline, who do I contact for that outage to make them aware? So when we talk about configuration management and the CMDB, they define one area to be able to store these items, but we want to look at them from different perspectives. I am solely going to focus on service configuration. There's another session that actually looks at the other part of this you can take a look at as well. I think they're both considerations that you have to take in mind of what are you modeling, what are you looking at. From an ITIL standpoint, the purpose of service configuration management is to ensure that we have an accurate, reliable understanding of these services and also the underlying supporting data. So that includes the information of application systems, where it's running, all of that information. Now, I want to use an example because we can go overboard of what we actually capture and manage. But before I want to kind of give you a practical example. I love maps. Prior to working technology, I was in Coast Guard aviation. I spent a lot of time in the back of an aircraft as a navigator, following a map. And the map told me, say, this airport has this signal that I can go ahead and tune into for navigation purposes. So really critical of understanding that map, but I wasn't overloaded. The other things, I love travel. I miss part of COVID. Hopefully we get back to travel one of these days soon, is the ability to spend time in London, one of the cities I've spent a lot of time in over the years. And the great thing of a map is I can understand, where things are at, and there's relevant information fairly at a high level. That's one of the great things of a digital map. And what's really allowing me to move around and understand is because of the services. I know that there's connecting services that make it easy to move through this environment. Think about your operations team. Something's going on here. What is going on with the service? How is it related? Where is it connected? So there's a certain layer that I need to be able to function, but I don't need everything. If you think about the Isle of Dog, which is a fantastic, the Canary Wharfs part of London, there is so much detail at that level of things that are in that area, but I'm not spending time around that service area. Actually, where I want to go is close to St. James Park. Now I know exactly what it is. This is my neighborhood of focus. My team spends most of their time here because they love the fish and chips at the Laughing Halibut, and the services and capabilities that they are focused on are in this neighborhood. And that's the way we need to think about the world we've seen shifted. It's outside the four walls of our organization, and cloud has changed that. So we need to present and map data in a way that fits to the team with the right balance of data. So let's actually get to the practical side of this. How does a team take on and map out a service model, a service map that makes sense, that delivers the right balance of value without going overboard? So let's take a look at examples. But first, this goes to the CMDB. There's a lot of data out there, and I've seen this in the past. Gartner has a study that's found that 90% of traditional CMDB projects in the past have had some level of failure. And that is because sometimes they boil the ocean. They try and find everything. Yes, I have, 70 million CIs of items I found. But the question, and I've seen that lately in some conversation with customers, and this is fine. If that data is value and it's used, fantastic. But here's kind of the span of the scope. Some organizations, and this oftentimes it comes from an organization starting up or really haven't had the time or the need to invest. So they don't have a CMDB. And you'll find sometimes there that when they come across an incident, and I've seen enterprise organizations along this line that maybe have come up through the software space of startups, their response practices are slower. They've adapted, but they have missing information. So there's a lot of time spent searching for data. Now, cloud has actually made that easier. And so I think there's another place to advocate for on this, but there's the other spectrum. We're trying for that, perfect CMDB, the ability to have everything that we think we need collected, but there's a high cost for that. And there's a lot of information overload. It has an impact of slowing down processes and practices. And so what we advocate for is that balanced, asking yourself, what's the right investment? Not that I have to get everything, but where do I get the right balance so I have enough in the value? And that team is always learning from teams as they go through incident reviews or change reviews. They said, yeah, but we really can make a better decision if we had this data. So I think that's the key part of it. And the last part of the list there, they embrace automation. And so that's the key aspect of this as well. So when we think about this, where do we begin actually is about the collection and that data and finding that balance in the value. And ultimately, when we do that, we do this based on the goals of the organization. We want to find alignment. Now, how do we find that alignment? Here's a strategy that I've seen used very successfully. And that is when we begin, we don't start by simply turning on discovery and find everything and then trying to piece it together. I always consider like there's an entire forest we now found, and I've got to kind of piece this together of what's above it, and I'm lost in that forest. Instead, start at your services. Maybe it's starting with just 1 to 2, using 1 to 2 of those as the learning experience to map this out. And then start asking yourself questions as you go through a modeling exercise. How are you classifying these? Are these business services? Are they technical? Are they application? Are they maybe even microservices if you're going to manage at that level? But I think that's asking yourself of some data that you may need to further classify or associate with these services. The other side of this is who owns it, and then who is actually using that service. Is it internal service? Are there business stakeholders that use it? Is this customer facing and important to our customers? The other part of that is what are the functions and capabilities to enable this service? Now, this gets to the business side because maybe a service is e-commerce. The function is for customers to buy items, but the capability might be numerous in there, and there might be underpinning technologies that further enhance those capabilities. So it might open up additional data or items you need. So it's asking the question of your services around that. The other aspect is what metrics do we track to help us understand the value of these services? I think that's another key thing of getting that alignment back to the business and what, KPIs, SLAs, SLOs, and even value metrics that we want to understand. Now, as we look down towards the technology stack, some of the questions change. First of all, we want to understand which of our IT support practices are focused on this. It also goes to the team that's supporting it as well, which we'll talk about in a second. What is the infrastructure that's needed to deliver this? Now, here's where things are radically changed. You see that layer of the infrastructure. That is probably on your own data center or some cloud provider. You may not need to pull all of that data in. In fact, one engineering team that they had kind of abandoned their legacy CMDB. They're using a more traditional ITSM tool, and they're now adopting Jira Service Management. But this is an enterprise customer. What they had done, they abandoned it. They modeled just their applications and services layer. And they're getting a lot of value around when something is provisioned. So when something changes or when something goes down, they have good context for those teams to troubleshoot that. So understanding that infrastructure layer is really important, and asking yourself the question and being very almost stringent on, do we really need this data? Is there a consumer of this data So that way you're only putting into your CMDB the data that will be useful, and that's that balanced approach that we talked about. And I think the final thing is just asking about your teams. Which teams are involved in that service, whether it's from a dev perspective or an IT perspective. What I have found over and over again, this focused approach at the service layer gives you that focus downstream to get the right information to start. And then the next part I've seen with another customer is they do retrospectives. Out of the last incidents and changes over the last 30 days, the service configuration team is going back and looking at what data was missing. Did they call out any data? Where could we refine and improve upon this? Which services are coming online? And so it also goes to their service portfolio and service portfolio planning. So a lot of possibilities here, but this has been very successful for a lot of customers. A couple of the things to consider as we wrap up this section of just really it's connecting your service management goals with the business goals. Are they aligned? Working with relevant stakeholders, both on the business side, but also think about the service owner, security, development, engineering, where this is a convergence happening, where teams are coming around common areas of work around services, involving them in this overall effort. The other thing is start where you are. Be very selective. It might begin with just one service and then grow from there. Could be 5 or 6, but don't try and boil the ocean of let's do these 50 services and model them out. Because what you'll do is you'll find that as I bring these services online and I'm getting more feedback, the next one we model will have ideas that we can improve upon that. One example of that I have is a university, major university in the United States here. When they were building their service model, they actually went to the librarians and they said, help us understand a taxonomy that we need to create as we build our service model for the university. I thought it was a really fantastic approach and insight that they got a lot of value out of. Again, think ahead, think about growth, think about changes in your service model, the way you define business and technical, how you store these objects, how you connect them to different infrastructure objects. Is it simply, that it's running in AWS and you have a console to go there? So these type of things, think about the way this will grow and evolve. And then finally, just embracing agility with this is in the way that you team practice. As I said a minute ago, embracing the idea of retrospectives, going back and looking at what's going on in our service catalog, but also how are things with the teams that are using it and learning from that. And then publish your learning, share with your teams, your business leaders. And I think there's a lot of value that you can unlock from this here as you work through this evolution of this practice. So what does this look like in the product? I want to just take just a minute because there's a lot of exciting new updates that we've shipped, our product team has shipped, and also through the integrations of insight into the Jira Service Management Jira platform. I want to talk about that. What does it actually look like with the product and connected there? So one of the things that we added last fall was this idea of services. We now can define a service very quickly. That service is the unifying layer, and there's a lot more, as you've heard at team. These sessions over the last couple of days. There's a lot of work going on around this and exciting areas of innovation. But what it allows us to do out of the box today is I can define a service object. I can connect that to my repos. That means whenever someone does a commit, I know what that's related to. I can go and find that. That whether it's Bitbucket, Jenkins, and all of the other CI/CD tools that we're supporting, we get good context what's going on the dev side. We also know what projects are related to, so we can see those issues. But from an IT standpoint, I know the team that's responsible for response to incidents, response to changes, and I start to really unlock some interesting insights. Now, what it has allowed us to do is we can create a service object like this one. I know who the application or the support team is. I know who's involved in the approvals, and I have an understanding of the hierarchy and what tier the service is. One thing that we just recently shipped with the new version of Insight coming into cloud is that we now have a schema inside of Insight that will allow us to integrate this data with the infrastructure or sources of where it runs. So for the example of Open Web Store, I now have that service object in here, but I can connect it to, let's say that one's running in our data center because it's legacy. I have the ability to look at and understand where is that running? Or let's say it was in AWS, I could connect it to that data as well. So the flexibility of Insight, being able to have different schemas and to connect the data where it makes sense, simply just through a reference, is very powerful. In fact, it's something that going back to my days of ITSM consulting, I wish I had this level of flexibility that the traditional CMDB tools don't offer to us. So super excited about that and where that will go. One other thing now, what does that mean now that this data is here, a part of our support practices? Well, one, this is during a major incident response. And this is a part of the Opportunity incident response features that are built into Jira Service Management. I can launch into an incident response and start to investigate, bring up this timeline, say, oh, look at this. We had a failed deployment last night, and it's because they associated their deployment to the service, and I'm able to understand and work through that. So this is the types of valuable service configuration insights you're unlocking for a team. They know what actually is causing it and potentially which team to go get involved to help fix it. On the other side, it's simply looking at a change and getting better context, saying this upgrade to this gateway, I know it's related to the open web service. I can help it in scoring the risk or getting the right team in for the change approval. So what resources are out there to help me learn and continue on this journey? Because today I've only just skimmed across the surface. I want to share two with you that are well worth your time to, in addition to the ITIL guide that I showed you earlier, is to go ahead and get a copy of Atlassian's guide to complete guide to ITSM. It was a continuation of the ITIL guide. What we did here when we wrote this was we asked the question, okay, these are the practices that a high velocity team might adopt. How would we configure the product around these teams? And it offers some insights in that context, of which one of those is service configuration management. How do I take this service-centric approach and apply that and make it happen? And so it offers some really good insights in addition to all of these other practices. But I'm also excited to share with you a recent release only in the last couple of weeks is this asset and configuration management handbook. So it looks at both the asset management side of this and the data I would want to manage, as well as configuration management. And it allows you to learn good practices to implement around these types of objects or assets that you're going to make a part of your ITSM deployment in Jira Service Management. So take some time to check those out, download those. I think they'll offer some great insights. I hope today's session has been helpful for you. I appreciate you taking some time to join me to walk through this. The practice innovations, while we did focus on service configuration management, can be applied to all of the practices. It goes back to asking those questions around the culture and the way that teams work, and then starting to unlock those areas where you can help guide those types of conversations. So I thank you for joining, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you in person one of these days in an upcoming event. Thanks.